is one of the most notorious assassinations in modern history. The murder of the Romanovs, Russia's ruling family. Once the subject of a high-stakes murder investigation, the trail went cold over 50 years of Soviet rule. Now, the mysterious deaths are fueling a heated battle between forensic scientists, religious leaders, and Russia's political elite. Are the bones buried in St. Petersburg really those of the Romanovs?
For more than 100 years, the Romanov story seemed solved. The family was executed. Their remains were found. DNA confirmed their identities. Case closed. History settled. Move on. Except one detail never made sense. Hidden inside the Tsar's genetic code was something scientists could not explain. A rare anomaly that appeared in his DNA like a signature written in invisible ink. When researchers first discovered it, they treated it as a problem. A complication that created doubt instead of certainty. Some officials questioned whether the remains truly belonged to Nicholas II at all. The uncertainty lingered for years, keeping conspiracy theories alive, allowing myths of escape and survival to flourish in the shadows of incomplete proof. Then technology advanced. The same DNA was examined again with tools that did not exist when the bones were first discovered. And what those tools revealed was not just who died in that basement in 1918.
A renewed investigation into their murders. Together with their 4 daughters and son, the family was killed by revolutionary Bolsheviks in 1918. A mass grave was found in 1993.
It was what happened in the desperate hours that followed. It was the fear that drove men to drag bodies through a forest at night. It was the political terror that made them burn and dissolve the remains of a 13-year-old boy. It was the proof that destroyed every romantic legend of a surviving princess and replaced it with something far more disturbing. The anomaly that once created doubt became the evidence that made doubt impossible. A genetic fingerprint that survived fire, acid, and a century of secrecy to tell the truth about one of history's most infamous nights. This is the story of the Romanov execution.
Tsar Nicholas II and the royal Romanov family were executed on orders from the revolutionaries who had taken control of their country.
Not the version you learned in school. The version written in DNA. The empire that collapsed in blood. By 1917, the 300-year reign of the Romanov dynasty had crumbled into chaos. Revolution swept through Russia like a fever, burning away centuries of imperial rule in a matter of months. Tsar Nicholas II, once the absolute ruler of the largest empire on earth, abdicated the throne under pressure from forces he could no longer control.
The imperial guard itself abandoned the Tsar. And the Tsar abdicated. In the night of March 15th, 16th, 1917, the most powerful monarchy of Europe has just collapsed.
The man who had commanded armies and decided the fates of millions was suddenly powerless. And powerlessness in revolutionary Russia was a death sentence waiting to be signed. Within months, the imperial family became prisoners of the Bolshevik state. Nicholas, his wife, Tsarina Alexandra, their 4 daughters, Olga, Tatiana, Maria, and Anastasia, their only son, the hemophiliac heir Alexei, just 13 years old. They were stripped of their titles, stripped of their freedoms, stripped of everything that had once made them the most powerful family in Russia. The Bolsheviks moved them far from the capital, first to Siberia, then to the industrial city of Yekaterinburg in the Ural Mountains. There, the family was confined inside a merchant's house that had been seized and renamed with chilling bureaucratic precision, the House of Special Purpose. The name was not symbolic. It was prophetic. The windows were painted over with whitewash, sealing the family inside a world of artificial twilight. Guards watched their every movement. Each day, their confinement tightened. Each day, the world outside grew more dangerous. The anti-Bolshevik White Army was advancing toward Yekaterinburg, and the revolutionaries faced a terrible calculation.
Prisoners of communist revolutionaries fighting to control Russia. Just past midnight, with troops loyal to the Tsar fast approaching the city.
If the city fell and the Tsar was liberated, he could become a rallying point for the counter-revolution. The Romanov name still carried power. That power had to be extinguished. Before dawn on July 17, 1918, the family and 4 loyal attendants were shaken awake. Guards told them the White Army was approaching and that they needed to be moved to safety for their own protection. They were ordered downstairs. Nicholas carried his frail son, whose hemophilia made walking difficult. Alexandra followed behind, weakened by years of stress and illness. With them went their 4 daughters, the family doctor, a maid, a cook, and a valet. 11 people descended into a basement room measuring roughly 14 by 17 feet. It was bare. It was cramped. It was inescapable. They were told to wait. Then armed men entered the room. 11 executioners for 11 victims. Their commander, Yakov Yurovsky, read a brief statement. The Ural Soviet had decided their fate. What followed was not the swift, clinical execution the Bolsheviks had planned. What followed was chaos. The basement that became a slaughterhouse. The execution erupted into violence that no one in that room had anticipated. Rifle fire filled the small basement, the sound deafening in the confined space. But something was wrong. Many bullets failed to do what bullets are supposed to do. Bodies that should have fallen immediately remained standing. Shots that should have been fatal seemed to bounce away. The executioners did not know that the Romanov daughters had sewn heavy jewels into their undergarments. Diamonds, emeralds, precious stones worth fortunes hidden against their bodies as a last desperate attempt to preserve the family's wealth in case of escape or exile. Those hidden gems turned the corsets into improvised armor. Bullets ricocheted off bodies and walls, filling the basement with confusion and terror. The executioners panicked. Their careful plan was unraveling in real time. The victims were screaming. The shooters were shouting. Smoke filled the room. The cramped space became a nightmare of noise and blood and bodies that refused to die quickly. The men moved in closer, using bayonets and rifle butts to finish what the gunfire could not. The violence became intimate and brutal. Screams echoed against the stone walls until finally, mercifully, they stopped. When the smoke cleared, 11 bodies lay on the floor. The Tsar, the Tsarina, all 5 children, the doctor, the maid, the cook, the valet. An entire world extinguished in minutes. For decades, the events of that night were recorded only by the men who carried them out. Their version stood largely unchallenged, not because it was complete, but because no other evidence existed to contradict it. An empire had ended in that basement, but what followed would prove that the night was far from over. The true plan extended well beyond those 17 minutes of gunfire, and the decisions made in the hours after the execution would create a mystery that would take nearly a century to solve. The forest that kept secrets. After the shooting ended around 2:30 in the morning, the Bolsheviks faced a problem they had not fully planned for. 11 bodies remained, and every one of them was evidence. If the truth became public, if the world learned what had happened in that basement, the consequences could reignite civil war and destabilize the new regime. The killings alone were not enough. The evidence had to vanish completely. The bodies were loaded onto a truck and driven deep into the forest outside Yekaterinburg. The first plan was simple and desperate. The men intended to throw the bodies into an abandoned mine shaft known as the Four Brothers. They believed the pit was deep enough to hide everything forever. They were wrong. When they reached the site, it became immediately clear that the shaft was too shallow. Anyone looking down could still see the bodies. The disposal that was supposed to take minutes was already failing. Time was slipping away. Dawn was approaching. Panic took hold. In a hurried attempt to destroy identifying features, the bodies were stripped and doused with sulfuric acid, then set on fire. The effort failed. Burning 11 bodies completely in a forest clearing without proper equipment was impossible. The flames consumed clothing and hair and surface tissue, but the bones remained. The faces remained recognizable enough to identify. The executioners were still surrounded by evidence as the sky began to lighten. In a final desperate decision, they split the remains. A large grave was dug in the forest, where 9 bodies were buried together, covered with earth and debris and railroad ties to disguise the disturbed ground. The remaining 2 bodies, Tsarevich Alexei and one of his sisters, were taken further into the forest and buried separately in a smaller pit, roughly 75 meters from the first site. The men involved swore to keep the locations secret. They disguised the graves as best they could. They returned to Yekaterinburg and told the public that the royal family had been moved to safety. The lie was simple and effective. What they were really destroying was not just bodies. It was the possibility of reconstruction, the possibility of shrines, the possibility of martyrs around whom resistance could rally. For more than 70 years, the graves remained hidden. The secret held. The truth waited beneath the forest floor for technology that did not yet exist to uncover it. The geologist who found an empire. For decades, the fate of the Romanov family remained one of history's most closely guarded secrets. The men involved in the execution left behind sketches, maps, and cryptic notes, unable to forget what they had done. But speaking of it under Soviet rule meant imprisonment or death. Fear silenced witnesses, and the secret endured. Then came Alexander Avdonin, a geologist by profession, but a historian at heart. While officially studying soil and rock formations in the Urals, he pursued the stories of hidden graves and escaped heirs, piecing together fragments of eyewitness accounts, old maps, and rumors whispered by elderly locals. In 1976, his relentless investigation led him deep into the forests near Yekaterinburg, where he discovered a grave containing 9 skeletons. Every detail, the number of remains, their arrangement, and the location, pointed unmistakably to the Romanovs and their loyal servants. Revealing the site, however, was impossible. The Soviet Union still held power, and announcing the discovery would have been politically explosive. Avdonin confided only in a small circle, including filmmaker Gely Ryabov. For 15 years, they kept the secret, revisiting the grave, documenting their findings, and waiting for the world to change. The collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 finally removed the barrier of fear.
The Soviet government falls. Ryabov decides that the time is right to reveal the secret of the Romanov grave.
Avdonin and Ryabov led Russian authorities to the site, and the official excavation confirmed their discovery. 9 skeletons consistent with the Tsar, Tsarina, 3 daughters, and 4 devoted servants. The revelation shocked the world, finally providing physical evidence of the execution that had been denied for 70 years. Yet the discovery left a haunting question. The Romanovs had 5 children, but only 3 daughters were found in the grave. Where were Alexei and the missing daughter? Had someone truly escaped? Answering that question would require cutting-edge science that was only just beginning to unlock the secrets of the past. The Romanov mystery, long buried, was far from over. The anomaly that created doubt. Identifying ancient remains is not as simple as comparing bones to photographs. The 9 skeletons from the forest grave had been in the ground for 7 decades. They were damaged, incomplete, mixed together in ways that made visual identification impossible. The only way to know for certain who lay in that grave was to read the genetic code preserved in their bones. Scientists extracted DNA from the remains and compared it to genetic material from living relatives of the Romanov family. The results confirmed what the location and historical records suggested. These were indeed the Russian royals and their servants. But one detail in the evidence refused to settle quietly. To identify Tsar Nicholas II specifically, researchers examined his mitochondrial DNA. the genetic material passed down through maternal lines. They compared it to samples from relatives who shared his maternal ancestry. The results were close, but they were not perfectly uniform. Inside the Tsar's mitochondrial DNA was something unexpected. The sample showed a rare condition known as heteroplasmy. Instead of a single mitochondrial DNA sequence, Nicholas carried two slightly different versions at the same time. Some of his cells contained one genetic sequence, while other cells contained a slightly different version. Both patterns were present simultaneously in the same person. This was an extreme genetic rarity, estimated to occur in only about 1% of individuals. At the time of the initial analysis, heteroplasmy was not well understood. The presence of two overlapping genetic signatures where there should have been one created confusion. Some scientists questioned whether the identification was valid. Some Russian officials expressed doubts. Could these remains truly belong to the Tsar if the DNA did not match cleanly? The uncertainty reopened doubts that many believed had been settled. It provided just enough ambiguity to keep conspiracy theories alive. Maybe someone had escaped. Maybe the bones were not who everyone claimed. Maybe the romantic stories of a surviving Romanov princess were true after all. For more than 16 years, the case remained unresolved in the public mind. 2 children were still missing. The genetic anomaly remained unexplained. The Russian Orthodox Church refused to formally recognize the remains without the missing children. The family could not be fully laid to rest. History itself seemed unwilling to let the story end. What few recognized at the time was that the anomaly was not a flaw in the evidence. It was a marker, a genetic signature that belonged to one person and one person only. The very detail that created doubt would eventually become the detail that destroyed it. The second grave. For 16 years after the discovery of the 9 bodies, the fate of Alexei and his missing sister remained unknown. The gap in the evidence allowed speculation to thrive. Stories of escape and survival circulated endlessly, fueled by uncertainty rather than proof. The myth of Anastasia.
The tale of Grand Duchess Anastasia Nikolaevna, youngest daughter of Tsar Nicholas II.
The princess who somehow survived the execution became embedded in popular culture. Books were written, films were made. The romantic possibility of escape softened the brutality of what had actually happened. That possibility ended in the summer of 2007. A group of amateur historians had been studying the written account left by Yakov Yurovsky, the commander of the execution squad. In his private notes, Yurovsky described burning the bodies of 2 victims at a separate location, away from the main grave. He provided rough directions, distances, landmarks that might still exist after 90 years. The searchers focused on a clearing less than 100 meters from the first burial site. What they uncovered was not a grave in any traditional sense. It was a shallow pit, barely 2 feet deep. Inside were 44 charred bone fragments and several teeth. Nothing intact, nothing immediately recognizable as human remains. But forensic analysis revealed what the eyes could not see. The fragments belonged to 2 young individuals. One was a boy between 12 and 15 years old. The other was a young woman between 15 and 19. The ages aligned precisely with 13-year-old Alexei and one of his older sisters.
The parts of skeleton presented for investigation belong to Tsarevich Alexei Nikolaevich and his sister, Princess Maria Nikolaevna Romanov.
More significantly, the condition of the remains told a story of deliberate destruction that went far beyond mere disposal. The bones showed signs of prolonged burning at extreme temperatures, likely exceeding 900 degrees Fahrenheit. They had been calcined, heated, until the organic material completely broke down. They had been broken apart and soaked in sulfuric acid. This level of destruction was not the result of haste or incompetence. It was intentional. The executioners had not treated all bodies equally. They had selected 2 for separate handling, They had subjected those two to destruction far beyond what the other 9 received, and they had done so for a specific reason. The fingerprint that exposed the fear. The bone fragments from the second grave were sent to forensic laboratories around the world. The damage to the DNA was severe, far greater than anything found in the first grave. Fire and acid had nearly destroyed the genetic material. Many experts believed the remains were beyond analysis. They were wrong. Technology had advanced dramatically since the first grave was discovered. Scientists were able to extract both mitochondrial DNA and nuclear DNA from the fragments. Nuclear DNA, inherited from both parents, provided detailed genetic profiles. The results were compared against DNA recovered from the first grave and against samples from living Romanov relatives scattered across Europe. The conclusion was unanimous across every laboratory that examined the evidence. The mitochondrial DNA confirmed the remains belonged to children of Tsarina Alexandra. The nuclear DNA confirmed they were the biological children of both Alexandra and Tsar Nicholas II. Y chromosome analysis identified the boy as a direct male descendant of the Tsar. Alexei had been found. He had not escaped. He had been burned and dissolved in the forest 75 meters from his parents and sisters. The identification of the girl took longer, but DNA eventually confirmed her as Maria, the third Romanov daughter. She was 19 years old when she died, old enough in the minds of her killers to potentially marry and produce heirs, old enough to represent a threat to the new order they were building. But one final detail closed the case with absolute finality and revealed the terror that drove the entire night. The rare heteroplasmy found in Tsar Nicholas II, the genetic anomaly that had once created doubt about his identification, was inherited by his son. That same unusual pattern appeared in the DNA extracted from the boy's remains in the second grave. The trait occurs in approximately 1% of individuals. Finding it in both father and son, in 2 separate burial sites discovered 16 years apart, was conclusive beyond any statistical possibility of coincidence. The anomaly that once delayed certainty became the proof that made doubt impossible. And suddenly, the motive behind the separate burial became horrifyingly clear. The DNA evidence did more than identify bodies. It exposed the psychological state of the men who spent hours in that forest destroying evidence. Alexei was the heir to the Russian throne. He was the direct continuation of the Romanov line. If any member of the family had to be rendered absolutely untraceable, it was him. The separate destruction of his body was not an afterthought or an accident of circumstance. It was a political act designed to sever the line of succession completely. Even in death, even after bullets and bayonets, the Bolsheviks feared what the Tsarevich represented. Maria was old enough to marry. She could theoretically produce children with a claim to the throne. She represented a future the revolutionaries were determined to prevent. The intensity of the destruction confirms the depth of that fear. Hours were spent dragging bodies through the forest. Hours were spent building fires and waiting for them to burn. Hours were spent breaking bones apart and dissolving remains in acid. This was not concealment. This was eradication. This was men who understood that if the main grave was ever discovered, the absence of the heir would create uncertainty. It would allow hope to survive. It would destabilize any attempt at restoration. What the genetic evidence ultimately revealed was that the night of July 17, 1918, was not a single act of violence. It was a sustained operation driven by panic. A failed execution in the basement, where Jules turned bullets aside and bayonets had to finish what rifles started. A failed disposal at the mine shaft where the pit proved too shallow. A 2-site burial operation that stretched toward dawn, carried out by exhausted men who knew the White Army was approaching. The executioners believed they could erase the Romanov line completely. They failed. The one detail they could not destroy was written into the blood itself. Every member of the Romanov family was now accounted for. Every escape theory collapsed. Every romantic legend of a surviving princess died in a laboratory. Anna Anderson, the most famous Anastasia claimant, was proven through DNA analysis of preserved tissue samples to be a Polish factory worker named Franziska Szankowska. She had never been a Romanov. The myth collapsed completely. For nearly a century, the Romanov story lived in uncertainty. It was shaped by rumor, fear, propaganda, and the romantic human desire to believe that someone might have survived. The legend of Anastasia persisted because it offered hope inside an otherwise unbearable tragedy. It softened the truth. It made the unthinkable slightly more bearable. Science ended that illusion completely. There was no escape. There were no survivors. Every member of the Romanov family died in Yekaterinburg on July 17, 1918.
Yakov Yurovsky had relocated the bodies of the royal Romanov family on July 19, 1918.
Every one of their loyal servants died with them. The execution was not swift or merciful. It was chaotic and brutal. The disposal was not efficient or complete. It was panicked and desperate. The men who carried out the killing spent hours in the forest trying to destroy evidence that would ultimately outlast them all. The Romanov investigation did more than solve a historical mystery. It demonstrated capabilities that forensic science would carry forward into the modern era. DNA was extracted from remains that had been burned, dissolved in acid, and buried for nearly a century. Techniques developed during this investigation are now used in laboratories worldwide to identify victims of disasters, crimes, and conflicts. Every false claim of Romanov survival was tested. Every romantic story confronted the evidence. Anna Anderson, the most famous Anastasia claimant, was proven through DNA analysis to be a Polish factory worker. The myth collapsed completely. In 2008, the Russian government formally acknowledged that all 7 members of the imperial family had been identified. The bodies were given state funerals. The Romanovs were finally laid to rest. But the true legacy of this investigation is not political recognition. It is the demonstration that truth can survive anything. Fire could not destroy it. Acid could not dissolve it. 70 years of secrecy could not bury it. The genetic anomaly that seemed like a complication, the heteroplasmy that once created doubt, became the fingerprint that made identification absolute. The executioners had one mission on July 17, 1918. Kill the Romanovs, erase them from history, prevent any possibility of restoration or martyrdom. They succeeded at the killing. They failed at everything else. The bones remained. The DNA remained. The truth remained. An empire ended in blood that night. But from that destruction emerged evidence that no amount of fire or acid or fear could ever erase. The Romanov story is no longer a mystery. It is a documented case of attempted erasure that failed. Biology outlasted secrecy, evidence outlasted myth, and a genetic anomaly that one man carried in his blood crossed a century to tell the world exactly what happened when the House of Special Purpose earned its name. The Romanovs are gone. Their killers are gone. The empire they ruled is gone. But the truth about that night will endure as long as science can read the code written in human cells. Some secrets are simply too deep to stay buried forever. This one took 90 years to surface, but it surfaced completely. And nothing in the historical record will ever undo what DNA has proven. The case is closed, not by confession, not by document, by the most fundamental evidence biology can provide. The genetic fingerprint of a murdered family, preserved against all odds, speaking across a century to tell the story their killers tried so desperately to silence. They failed. The Romanovs had the last word after all.